लॉकडाऊन येण्याच्या पूर्वी आम्ही आठवड्यात 2दा ऑफिसला जायचो. आता ते पण बंद झालं.
तुम्ही मॅथमॅटिक्स कडे कसे वळलात? तुम्ही फिजिक्स नाही शिकवत?
काय जमणार फिजिक्स
देशपांडे सर सुरू केलंय.
बर बर, मग
आम्ही फक्त मॅथमॅटिक्स शिकवतो.
आम्ही सुरू करतो बरं का आता.
आवाज जरा जोरात जवळ घ्या माईक. आवाज जोरात पाहिजे.
आवाज जोरात पाहिजे. I welcome the audience present on Zoom, present on Facebook, as well on YouTube. This is the 59th lecture in the series of Vijnana Ganga, co-hosted by IB Chavan Pratishthan, Mumbai, and Marathi Vijnan Parishad. This lecture series was instituted in the year 2016, almost 5 years back. Only 2 or 3 lectures were missed on various reasons. However, otherwise the continuity is maintained. We used to have these lectures at YB Chavan Pratishthan's auditorium until last March. Afterwards, we have the restrictions of not getting together, so we continued this particular lecture series on Zoom app, Facebook, YouTube. I welcome Professor Mayank Wahiya for this particular lecture. Mayank Wahiya was a professor in TIFR since 1979 until 2016. Mayank has interest in high energy astrophysics, cosmic rays, and gamma rays. He studied them by experimentation as well as by modeling. He participated in Anuradha experiment. The space shuttle was flown in 1985 and India X-ray astronomy payload flown in 1986. He had interest in solar and stellar flares. His latest field of interest is in archaeoastronomy. Some 3 years back, we have already heard him on this archaeoastronomy. He is interested in science popularization and he has delivered number of lectures, written number of articles to propagate science. He was director of Nehru Planetarium for a couple of years. Now also after his retirement, he is engaged in Narsi Monji Institute where he is teaching mathematics. Although his main subject is physics, we all know that physics and mathematics, they go hand in hand. So sometimes he looks towards the physics, sometimes he looks towards the mathematics. Now the phase of mathematics is going on in the life of Mayank Wahiya.
Yes,
now, Mayank is going to speak today on evolution of science. Now this is a very big canvas, because since the mankind has started progressing on the earth, the science has started progression. Evolution has thus begun. And it has not ended. Every day, the progress in science is going on, and that we have experienced during this COVID period for last year or so, that every day we discover something, we bring it in our life, how to use it gainfully and all that. So I do not know what particular spectrum Mayank is going to cover, but I leave it to him. I welcome Mayank. You can start your lecture now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Deshpande Sahib. That was very generous of you to say nice words about me. And it's my pleasure to be here for the second time. I miss, of course, the environment of the lecture room at Yashwantrao Chavan, but I suppose one has to live with life. The Deshpande Sahib asked the question about what kind part of the canvas of science that I'm going to talk about. And he made this important point that science started when the humanity began. And I'm going to take you through the journey of the entire development of science from the time humanity began and convince you that it is reaching now an interesting phase of difficulty, and that science is about to change its trajectory once again. To talk about evolution, science, and human understanding of working of nature, I'm going to use this painting that is a painting from Haber, and it's called Civilization, and it is in TIFR collection. And there you can see in the painting that on the left side you have these two human beings scared of the lightning that is on the top, as even as wild animals run around. Then they begin by worshipping the sun and the sources of energy and all the life's forces. And even as they begin farming and growing crops, etc., and learning to transport, learning to urbanize, they begin to meditate on the ways of nature and how nature works and all that. And eventually, as a result of all these technological evolution, they even end up controlling the electricity that used to once scare them so much. They can now harness and use electricity in a variety of ways, something that used to scare them once, and how that has given them completely new insights into the way nature is organized and the way nature is working. So, this is the journey we are going to talk about. So, let me begin by giving you a broad idea. The general impression, unfortunately, the world over is that science is something that is European, something that is Western. That Aristotle, that early Greeks started the work of science in terms of laws of flotation and Pascal and others, and that eventually Galileo, etc., developed science. And the point that I'm going to take is that this is not at all true. This is so obviously not true that I'm surprised that this myth still carries on. All civilizations have in the entire history of human race have played a very crucial role in the development of science, and that is the point I want to make. I will take you through that journey. There was a time when we were not actively pursuing science. There have been dark ages of science even in India, but now we are back onto the main course of science. But I'm going to show you how much of the contribution of science to how much of the foundations of science were laid by various civilizations on which the industrial revolution of the 16th century was built. It was not built in isolation. It was not built only on the knowledge of what Pascal or Socrates did. It relied heavily on the knowledge that was developed in India, China, West Asia, and so on, and Egypt, and so on. And that's the story I'm going to tell. In this talk, incidentally, I will use the word technology and engineering, science as interchangeable word. And my contention is that science began when human beings looked at the first threw when they first threw a stone to kill an animal. They started studying projectile motion and so on, and all that has added up to our modern science. So development, so human growth from these early stone tools of the kind that you find even in India at a lot of places. Some of these are even in Indian subcontinent are as much as 1.8 million years old. The oldest hominin species in India, in fact, is 1.8 million year old, and their remains have been found in Adambakam in south near Chennai. And there are various hominins over about there. And Homo sapiens, the modern man, comes a little later. But this is itself a technological revolution, and from there going all the way to rocket science has been a very long journey of human civilization. It has taken us 2 million to more than 2 million years to come where we have. It has not taken us just 4 or 5,000 years. It's a 2 million year old journey, and we are going to talk about this journey. Considering that all human and all life was designed to eat, not be eaten, and reproduce, what we have achieved in terms of understanding of the working of nature is simply phenomenal. It's simply astonishing. Because we were never, our brains were not designed for it, our senses were not designed for it, our life forms were not designed for it. We were designed to eat, not be eaten, and reproduce. All life has this a single purpose role. From there, having worked out what Higgs boson is, or to what the neutrino muon magnetic field is, etc., is a phenomenal achievement of human race. And this understanding has not arisen suddenly. It's not a question of a few thousand years. It has been a question of a few million years. And the result is of 2 million years of evolution and hard work by early hominids to Homo sapiens sapiens, which is us, and beyond, is what has resulted in this knowledge base. And I'm going to talk to that story. So sometimes I feel very upset when I see even Indian authors writing history of science begin with Greece. Greece came much later, and in fact what Greeks did also was forgotten by the Europeans. It was remembered by the Arabs, have been given back to the by the Europeans in 17th century when they went through about 2000 years of dark ages and came out. They could find literature available with the Arabs who had done phenomenal work in science. So this idea that science is Greece and science is Europe is nonsense. Science is as Indian as it can be, and that's what I'm going to try and work on. Lots of animals use tools. Humans are not the only ones who use tools. Here, there is an example of a parrot trying to use a stick to get a seed, or I think this is a chimpanzee trying to get ants out of the ant hill because he loves the taste of ants. Um, the science history of science has begun. The earliest archaic humans appear about a million years ago, and they are the ones. And in fact, even their earlier Homo erectus and so on were working on stone tools and developing better technologies. The first flake tools that we have today are 500,000 years old, but earlier crude tools are available for us back far back as 2 million years ago. But Homo sapien branch of the genus Homo developed stone tools about 500,000 years ago. The earliest hominid tools, like I said, are 2 million years old. Anatomically modern human being, somebody whom we would will recognize today, appears about 200,000 years, about 2 lakh years ago, but it takes them 150,000 years just to fully understand what they have, their language, their capabilities, and other things. So, behaviorally modern human being is only 50,000 years old. But the first person to stand with have brain size similar to ours and so on comes about 200,000 years ago. In fact, they had a higher brain size. The early Homo sapiens have a brain size of about 1500 cc compared to our modern humans who have about 1300 cc. But they appear about 50,000 or 200,000 years ago. Then, for reasons that we don't fully understand, around 200,000 years ago, these humans who evolved in Ethiopia spread all over Africa, and you can see evidence of them in South Africa as well as in sub-Saharan Africa. They invented bed. The earliest known pile of wood, softened wood pieces that we have seen is about 200,000 years ago in South Africa. We have seen earliest use of jewelry in terms of seashells with holes drilled into them is about 135,000 years ago. The controlled fire for cooking was learned by humans about 125,000 years ago, 1,25,000 years ago. Language is as old as 1 lakh years ago. So human being developed a fully comprehensible grammar in which they could convey to each other what they were doing and what they were planning to do is about 1 lakh years old. They began migration out of Africa about 1 lakh to about 70,000 years ago, and then they spread out to the entire Australasia. So they went all the way from Europe into Asia and even went on first to Australia and New Zealand, and then subsequently even into the American continents. The clothing, the earliest evidence we have of humans wearing clothes is about 70,000 years ago. The traps to catch animals that we have seen made from spring effect of bamboos and all that is about 70,000 years ago. The first use of bow and arrow seems to be as old as 64,000 years ago. Using bamboo and realizing the springiness of bamboo and tying a string was a great intellectual achievement and a technological revolution that happened 64,000 years ago. And because it was so old and because nobody knows the author of this invention, we think it is not important. But it was a crucial development on human evolution. Then after the human being spread to Africa and Europe, they had other developments. So behaviorally modern human beings, somebody who had a large brain, had a good body control and a good capability of organizing and language capability and all that, comes about 50,000 years ago. 50,000 year ago, human being today could be transplanted and put into any village or city in Mumbai, in India, and or anywhere in the world, and very soon they would become comfortable with that. They would not find themselves intellectually lacking in adapting to a modern environment. About 40,000 years ago, they became the most dominant member of genus Hominins. So they got rid of all the Neanderthals and the Denisovans and all the other species of genus Homo were essentially replaced by Homo sapiens all over the world around 40,000 years ago. Since then, they have created a lot of creativity. They have created musical instruments which were seen in Spain and Germany and all that about 40,000 years ago. They made female figurines of a few centimeters in size, which have been found in Germany. And there are obviously that these are Mother Earth images with exaggerated genitalia and so on. They're probably used for worship as early as 35,000 years ago. Pottery was invented about 20,000 years ago in China. We have the earliest evidence of pottery from China. The first design of constellations done on rock art comes from France in about 15,000 years ago. After that, around 12,000 years ago, a second major revolution seems to have happened in human evolution, which is that farming comes up. 12,000 years ago, humans first domesticate animals and start farming in Central Asia, in present day Turkey and in Central Asia region. Metallurgy appears 10,000 years ago. The first idea of heating using heat to purify metals in the soil comes around 10,000 years ago. The first writing comes in Mesopotamia, which is present day Iraq, about 8,000 years ago. Wheels and related technologies were invented about 5,000 years ago in Mesopotamia. Now, there are errors in these dates, obviously, but generally, this is the trend of developments that have happened. Then, in recent times, horse comes to humans in about 6,000 years ago. Interestingly, it's an American animal that migrated to Asia, and when it came to Central Asia, humans learned to harness him and learned to use the horse, and then horse turned out to be so useful that it invaded all aspects of human life. It became extinct in America, interestingly, and eventually it had to be sort of shipped from Eurasia back to America. But horse comes to humans in 6,000 years ago. Bronze and copper appears in human civilization about 5,000 years ago, and Harappans were phenomenal at using bronze and copper for their activities. Pyramids were built about 4,500 years ago, which is, of course, a great achievement in engineering and technology. Harappan cities are around the contemporaneous to that, about 4,500 years ago. Extremely elegant engineering, right angled city planning, massive water management systems, highly standardized building structures, highly standardized bricks, highly standardized tools, and so on, spread over 1.5 million years of square kilometers from all the way southern Iran to the Thar Desert in east, and from Gujarat all the way to Kashmir. This was the largest civilization of that time, greater than all the other civilizations put together. And we still don't fully understand this civilization by a wide margin. The first major religious text, Vedas, are about 4,000 years ago. Though there is a suspicion that Avesta probably might have been older, but we do not have a full-fledged version of Avesta. But a lot of things that are there in Avesta is also there in Rigveda, and there is an argument that can be made that Avesta is far more simplistic in its approach to gods and universe than Vedas. So Vedas are highly sophisticated, highly complex, beautiful poetry, very profound thoughts, and all that. That comes around 4,000 years ago. Mahabharata can be dated comfortably to about 3,300 years ago. Iron comes to India at the end of Mahabharata. Towards the end of Mahabharata, there is a story about Krishna wanting to look for a new kind of metal with which he can win the war, and that is where he identifies the first black metal, which turns out to be iron. Iron also is also in Central Asia. In India, iron can be put to 1300 to 1500 BC. Greek civilization peaked 3,000 years ago in Greece, obviously, Greece and Italy region. Persian's transcontinental kingdom, the first kingdom of the kind that occupied the entire Eurasia region, comes from Iran, and it is about 2,500 years ago. So Darius the Great, the whole bunch of kings were there, who actually controlled the entire region from Spain to the Hindu Kush mountains. That comes about 2,500 years ago. The Indian calendar Vikram Samvat started 2072 years ago in 58 BC. The Shaka calendar, which is also followed in India, started in 1993 years ago, that is AD 1778. So Vikram Samvat was started by Vikramaditya in Ujjain, 58 BC, while Shaka calendar was started by in South India by Satkarni in 78 AD. Indian numeral systems get introduced to the world in around 1600 AD. I'm sorry, I've not written the time. It should be 1600 AD. That is, well, almost 1,000 years ago, more than 1,200 years ago. First printing press was invented 600 years ago. The European expansion into the rest of the world began about 500 years ago, thanks to the fact that they had guns, germs, and steel, as it were. Taj Mahal was built 400 years ago. Telescope was invented 400 years ago. Aircrafts were invented 100 years ago. Transistor was invented 77 years ago. And the COVID vaccine, of course, was manufactured 1 year ago, or less than a year ago, in fact, 6 months ago. So essentially, none of these, all of these are scientific developments. All of them have happened across the board in various civilizations. And therefore, there is no culture or civilization that should claim ownership of science. Let us look at some of these things in detail. In this study, I'm going to take several parallel. I'm going to show that there are basically four different sets into which you can decide the development of science. There's one ad hoc approach of science, which is the early stone tool makers, etc. If something worked, they learned and they taught each other and learned and moved forward. Then religion comes into being, and religion dictates a lot of development in science. Some of it good, some of it bad, and so on. And this is largely a Bronze Age construct. Then at third stage, we have a more pragmatic approach to science, which led to Iron Age construction of various things and so on. And then, of course, comes the famous European axiomatic approach or industrial revolution approach that led to industrial approach. And along with the Iron Age, about 70 years ago, we also entered the Carbon Age. And we are about to enter the age of biology and so on. In more recent time, in the last 20, 30 years, you can see that science is no longer fully axiomatic. You are not in a position now to define everything axiomatically for various reasons, and I'll come to those limits towards the end of my talk. And now we are approaching a new kind of way of studying science, which is through logic-based, and I will talk about that a little later. For the present discussion, like I said, we will freely mix science and technology as faces of the same coin, and we will see how they mix. So let us look at ad hoc approach. It was purely utilitarian. No system was formally studied. Nobody said that if I hit the stone at an angle X, then I get a proper chip and so on. It was just trial and error. Instruments were built through intuitive feeling and experience. Science and technology begin this way. You may call this primitive, but it is still very significant in terms of amount of comprehension and experimentation that is required to come up with standardized technology, whether it is in terms of stone tools, whether it is organization of society, whether it is control of water resources and so on. These things were highly scientific for that period of time when there were no other technological development. Imagine if you were to be stranded alone in an island where there was vegetation but no technology, you would probably begin along the same line. A lot of technology that we in work tool even today uses that technology. For example, when I tell my carpenter to go and build me a table, he does not really go through the tensile strength of the kind of wood that he is using. He has an instinctive feel that teak wood is very expensive but the sturdiest, but so other woods will do, and plywood will also do provided you have these requirements. He goes instinctively. He does not bother about the tensile strength of aluminium, and he has not done any studies into metallurgy of aluminium. It is by feel that they work. Even today, a lot of what we do by feel, not by applying formal knowledge. Several developments are attributed to this stage: flake tools, jewelry, fire, language, rock art, bed, traps to catch small animals, spears, even bow and arrow, etc., are all developments of this purely utilitarian ad hoc approach to science. Many technologies were developed, often arose when technologies preceded science. So, shipping, architecture, steam engine, even X rays came out of random experimentation. And like I said, my carpenter today is entirely based on this method of working. Then religion started interfering at some stage into human life. Um, so then the universe was governed by a supernatural force, and therefore we had to be within the biddings of this supernatural force. So events were dictated by a supernatural being and his will, and that had a serious problem with free will, which means that you can only use things that the gods dictated you to use. It discouraged objective studies because everything was eventually to go to God and so on. And societies were organized along religious practices. The high priests had enormous powers, and it significantly molded the growth of civilization. The most dramatic example, of course, is Galileo having been put to confinement because he objected to this kind of approach to science. But there are many examples of religion having at some stage, in some sense, given rise to metallurgy and temple architecture, etc., also discouraged a lot of objective thinking. The third approach, so a lot of scientists who were sort of hemmed in by this religious diktat took a more pragmatic approach. And the pragmatic approach was that they still studied the nature, they still studied the way nature worked, but they said, okay, whether God exists or not, this is how God works. So they focused on the nature of regularities and rhythms of nature and simply pointed out to them and found ways in which they could predict or understand these rhythms, and they left the idea of the exact nature of them as beyond their comprehension, saying that whatever it is, it may be God who is running the stars, but the stars have a certain rhythm of working. It may be gods who make metal or make wood, but the wood can be used in this particular manner, and so on. A lot of mathematical formulation gets up that way. So if you look at Aryabhatta, etc., they're working. They are not bothered about gravity, but they definitely have clear formulation on how the planetary motion should be calculated. It's a very pragmatic approach to working of nature. So physical unity behind these mathematical models were never investigated in this feature because that was left to God. It allowed curious mind to study nature analytically, and it provided ways around religions and priests. And this approach tended to be more theoretical than experimental, and I'll come to the limitations of that. So where did it all start? It all started in Indus Valley, Sumeria, and Mesopotamia around the time of 3000 BC, and then other cultures joined in at a later time. Early sciences, most of the progress was made in Asia. Okay, if you look at the three cultures that I'm talking about, Sumer and Mesopotamia is present day Iraq. Egypt is well almost in contact with Asia, even though it is in Africa, and Indus Valley obviously is in the Hindu Kush mountains and beyond. So most of this development was in Asia. Mesopotamian culture in Tigris and Euphrates River, present day Iraq, flourished around 3100 BC, and it is called Jamdet Nasser period, where they first started urbanization, they first started planning, they first did major work in astronomy, including defining constellations and astronomy of excellence. So they had this realization that Jupiter and Saturn met in the same constellation after 60 years. So their entire number base was 60, and 60 has an advantage that is this is divisible by 2, 3, 4, 6, 8, and 10. And so it was a very versatile system. So they had a 60 base system rather than a decimal system, but they did some phenomenal mathematical work at that time. Compared to that, Indian urbanization takes place around 2700 BC. The first Harappan cities appear around 2700 BC. They were contemporaneous to Egyptians who were building pyramids and so on, and the Central Asian cultures about which again we don't have enough information. Then for almost 2000 years, from 600 BC to 1600 AD, India was one of the most significant centers for learning. And the first universities of the world, for example, the first major universities of the world come up at that time and so on. And we will look at the Indian contribution a little more in detail. India's decline in knowledge was taken up by Arabs. Fortunately, Arabs were very keen on noting down everything. So they sent a lot of scholars, including Al-Biruni, who came and documented a lot of Indian science. And when the renaissance of science happened in Europe, all this knowledge that Arabs had accumulated and added to became available to them. So the first idea that experiments should be the only arbiter on what is true in science is actually an Arab idea. It is not a European idea. Europeans simply adopted this idea. So if you still remember your history, the destruction of Constantinople, where Arabs had everything, or where Arab scholars and European scholars used to stick together and study. And when Constantinople was destroyed, the scholars went all over the world and distributed the knowledge, and that is how the industrial revolution started. But it is Arabs whose contribution, unfortunately, is very poorly studied, but they have done some phenomenal work. So what were Indians good at? So from the early periods, if you look at the earliest period prior to 1000 BC, Harappan civilization is a technological marvel. Its knowledge system itself was highly evolved. It was spread over 1,000,000 square kilometers. It had a highly standardized culture and so on, but I don't have time to talk about that. Then the number system, the idea of a decimal system, handling large numbers, handling zero and null ideas and all that appears very early in the Indian civilization, and it is later adopted by others. Sanskrit as a language, because it required oral precision, transmission, it was precise to an unprecedented degree. No language has reached that level of precision. ever. And Panini, for example, has specifically lists out all the grammatical rules about how the language should be spoken. And because it was spoken, and spoken language can get into errors of pronunciation of words and so on, there are multiple levels of testing that go into recitation in Sanskrit. So there are 6 levels of testing that go on, and of course, writing it in poetry and chand, etc., helps. It's a phenomenal visualization. Then design of nakshatras. The lunar mentions come from India. The zodiacal signs, the sun's movement was planned by the Sumerians, but nakshatras are essentially Indian in their origin. Then in the golden period from 1000 BC to 200 AD, we have a whole bunch of development. It's a late Vedic or Gnostic period where people were not committed to religion as much and were willing to explore. So the 6 great books come out at that time. The Nyaya Vaisheshika system comes out, the first genuine secular textbook. And Vaisheshika is my favorite book. I'll talk about it a little longer, little in a little while. But it's a completely secular text. Nowhere does it mention God. Nowhere does it mention magic. Nowhere does it mention will of the unknown or something. It's purely analytical in its nature. Nyaya investigates logic and how logic is to be used. Vaisheshika is concerned with nature and source and limits of knowledge. Then the second set of books are Yoga and Sankhya, which are the first books of medicine around first millennium BC to early centuries AD. Yoga is a part of that system of understanding the union of human and personal God, the Ishvara and human connections, and so on. Sankhya is the first one that worries about nature of being, existence, reality, and categorization. Sankhya, of course, is number, but there are more profound meanings of the word here. Then there are the other set of books called Mimamsa and Vedanta. Mimamsa investigate the nature of dharma, not in terms of religion, but in terms of duties to the world. The way Bhagavad Gita, for example, would define dharma. What are the duties of a human being? What are the responsibilities of human beings in a real environment? And then there is a Vedanta, which discusses the ultimate metaphysical reality of what is Brahman, who is Brahman, how do we understand, how do we investigate, and so on. So these are 6 great books. Amongst many things that came up, the universities at Takshashila, which started in 8th century BC and went on till 6th century AD, was a part of this great intellectual development. Buddha himself is supposed to have taught at some of these schools, and some of the great names of Indian philosophers were teachers there. And then Nalanda starts 3 centuries later at 5th century BC and goes on till 13th century AD. So these are there is a suspicion that there was probably something like a university in Central Asia a little earlier, but genuinely known and standardized universities of Takshila and Nalanda are in India at that time, and they were great centers of learning. Then we have the Siddhantic period starting with 500 AD to 1600 AD, where we construct a whole bunch of new ideas. So we formalize astronomical knowledge in terms of trigonometric angle calculations, cos functions, sine functions, and so on, and epicycles of planetary motions and all that. The heliocentric model of planetary motions and all that is all worked on. Speculations on whether the Earth was spinning or not are also there. The formulation of number zero. What are the properties of zero? What happens when you multiply a number with zero? What happens when you take powers of zeros and stuff like that? Is all worked out in 500 AD, and which is why, even though zero number as a placeholder was used all the way by Mesopotamians, Indians are credited with understanding the importance of zero and all its properties, and that comes around 500 AD. Temple architecture reached its peak. The oldest temples are much older, cave temples, etc. But the temple architecture that India is so famous for now starts around that period. Kerala School of Mathematics, 15th and 16th century, did phenomenal work in understanding sequences, numbers, and they even reached the ideas of limiting values, which are the foundations of differential mathematics, which would make a lot of difference in our understanding of the working of the universe. And Newton would use it with great effect. But that was first sort of experienced by Kerala School of Mathematics in a good 200-300 years before Newton did. And then, of course, there is modern period, which would probably start with the construction of Taj Mahal and Tipu Sultan's rockets, which are all phenomenal technological developments of that time. And then there are other achievements which are simply too numerous to hold of the modern period. So essentially, that is the contribution of India. At the same time, I want to emphasize some of the how elegantly beautiful they were. So Vaisheshika, for example, was written during the great renaissance of Indian sciences. It was It was written after Hinduism had reached largely been cleared of its ills and etc. with arrival of Buddhism. So it's a post Buddhism Jainism, and it had brought a sense of irreverence to studies in India. So it is essentially the so-called Nastika period. It was felt it is probably studied after the departure of Alexander from India. Sikandar comes to India 326 BC and then leaves. It was after Ashoka's reign. Ashoka dies in 232 BC after his expansion and Kalinga war, etc., etc. So it is 200, 2nd century BC is when it is written. And that time, the map of the rulers of Indian subcontinent extended all the way from Afghanistan and southern Iran or central Iran, all the way till the Brahmaputra Valley on the north, and Vindhyachal Mountains in the south, and they covered this large part of the country. And because it was a rich culture, it was because it had enough resources, they did spend a lot of energies in studying abstract ideas of science, and the great 6 books of science that I just mentioned came a part of that story. Vaisheshika itself was probably written in Mauryan Empire, and it held a it held swell as a standard textbook. It held sway as the standard textbook of physics for almost 1,000 years. And the very idea of Panch Mahabhut and 5 element theory, etc., comes from Vaisheshika. And therefore, Vaisheshika remained a standard textbook of science all the way from Chinese to the entire subcontinent and beyond, because it is very good. But it is qualitative. I'll show you how it is. And it held sway until the axiomatic approach took over. It just consists of 373 verses, so it is not a pothi. Okay, a 50-page. If you want to write a 100-page book on just Vaisheshika itself without commentary, you would have to pad it up a lot more because it would be more like a booklet, and that is all it is. And it is completely secular in approach. Doesn't even talk about supernatural. And I'll give you an example. So, for example, Vaisheshika asks, "What is knowledge?" And in 21st century, if you ask what is knowledge, they will tell you that the theory of knowledge says that you can get knowledge by sense perception, reasoning, emotion, faith, imagination, intuition, memory, and language. Compared to that, Vaisheshika has a completely different idea. Vaisheshika says knowledge can be obtained by perception, pratyaksha, by influence, by inference through anumana, analogy, the upamana, derivation from circumstances, arthapati, non-perception or negative cognition proof. So even negative cognition proof. Anna uplabdhi is a part of acquiring knowledge, something you tested and didn't happen. Verbal testimony of reliable persons, Shabda, is also part of the story. The interesting thing is that compared to modern theory of knowledge, emotion, faith, imagination, and intuition are not considered sources of knowledge. These need to be tested against experimentation in order to get converted into knowledge. So knowledge can be derived from arthapapti and anuplabdhi are accepted methods of getting knowledge. Negative experiments are accepted forms of knowledge. The structure of Vaisheshika itself is fairly interesting. It was written by it is authored by Kannada, is the name we have given, though we don't know much about him. It says material or matter, Pradartha, has 6 different constituents. The first is Dravya, and Dravya has materials which is solid, liquid, gas, sky, and energy, the Panch Mahabhuta for which we are so famous. Then there are active entities, which is Kala and Dika, which is direction or space and time. And then there are life forces of Mana and Atma. So at some stage, they must have wondered about what is life, which is different from non-living. And they gave an entity that Atma is present in the living. So all living beings are conscious. But then they realize that there are levels and levels of intelligence. So they give an additional concept of mana or mind for the intelligence. So they actually have 2 kinds of life forces of mana and atma. They clearly have an idea of kala and dika, which are processes, and then the panch mahabhut that make the quality. Then each of these things have a guna. So the gun consists of color, taste, odor, touch, feel, number, measure, distinctiveness, etc. A whole bunch of 24 properties are attributed as the gunas of these things. Then there is karma, movement up, movement down, contraction, expansion, displacement, etc. are all karma, the properties that change and so on. Then there are vaisheshika, vaishesha, there are specific properties of specific material. Gold is yellow and so on. And then there are inherited properties which comes from their history. And the last is samanya properties, existence, transient, cause and effect are all part of Samanya properties, which are generalized to everybody. And Vaisheshika, one of the first thing it does is to define causality. That if there any process is done, the cause must be there, and the cause must always precede the effect. There is no magic. If something is seen, there must have been a cause which caused that effect, and it's a purely secular in its origin. And this is 2nd century BC, mind you. So, for example, if you ask for general structure, the physical manifestations of matter are given here in the Panch Mahabhut. The life forces are given in life forces. Emotions, happiness, unhappiness, desire, aversion, etc., are given over here. Motion, all forms of motion, up, down, expansion, including expansion, contraction, and displacement, are given over here. Quantifiables, color, taste, odor, touch, temperature, measure, etc., can be done over here. And physical properties, fluidity, oiliness, elasticity, rigorousness, righteousness, etc., are given over here. So essentially various aspects of physical sciences are covered, and chemistry of course is here: distinctiveness, conjunction, disjunction, otherness, similarity, and so on. And so, for example, some of the foundations it laid was to say that causality is a must. In the absence of cause, there cannot be an effect. Substances are divided into dravyas and the properties to make padartham. Dravyas are neither created nor destroyed by karma. So physical action can neither create nor destroy dravya. On the other hand, gunas can be destroyed by cause and effect. Motion is a result of karma, and karma is opposed by karma. It cannot be opposed by anything else. The changes in guna is a result of karma, heaviness, effort, effort required, and contract and so on. So essentially, these are foundations of basic sciences. If you look, for example, want to know how fire happens, fire happens when liquid or solid gets energy and then produces conjunction, which produces gas and which produces more energy, and then you have your complete cycle of fire, which results in odor and which results in rise in temperature. So essentially, qualitatively, most of the physical phenomena of normal world can be interpreted understanding these set of features. There's no quantification, but there's certainly good qualitative explanation, purely secular, about how nature works based on the foundations given by Vaisheshika. There are certain shortcomings to this study, which was for the first one is that essentially everything was left to Prakriti Swabhava. Everything happens because of the according to the natural properties. Why that Prakriti Swabhava comes is something that is not investigated. Description of nature reached a plateau very soon because all the explanations were qualitative. It remained an intellectual pursuit of pure form. Students of science, because of caste system or whatever you have it, avoided direct experimental studies, which would have required mixing with artisans and so on, and that was something of a taboo. So while building of Harappan cities and Taj Mahal, etc., would have required phenomenal understanding of material properties relevant to that, it did not combine to give you the formal structure of physical sciences that Europe would give us later on. Social stratification almost certainly was the root cause of this non-mixing and non-investigation in Indian civilization context. Easy living condition discouraged studies of terrestrial world. We did not really require highly insulated houses, etc., because cold temperatures were rare. So some major fields of studies that we missed out was gravitation, thermodynamics, electromagnetism, and structure of matter. On the other hand, optics and molecular biology, we missed out in a very weird sense of the word, in the sense that the earliest class is in India about 1000 BC or so, but it was never converted into lenses. Molecular biology, we had an idea that the illnesses are caused by germs and so on, and Ayurveda is very clear on that, on how to build immunity and how personalities tend to make a particular disease, you too vulnerable to disease, etc. So there were vague ideas of optics and molecular biology, but the other four subjects of sciences we had completely missed, and corresponding technologies were never realized. So there was no question of having electricity, no question of air or space travel, no question of quantum mechanics and so on would come. So while the general idea of the relation between diseases and life forms existed, in the absence of microscope, that kind of qualitative studies didn't happen. The Chinese, on the other hand, were also a great culture, reasonably contemporaneous to us, and they built the great Silk Route, and on which they would like to now build up again, which was around 200 BC. Chinese developed silk and other technologies. So though there is some claim that even Harappans knew of silk, They of course had extensive technologies for warfare, and they also had extensive technologies for survival in extreme weather, something that Indians didn't need. However, the early trajectory of the civilization was did not put emphasis on religion and priests at all, so they avoided that trap and did not exert the kind of pressure that they did in India. But they were completely centralized. The king did everything, and though they were pragmatic in their approach to science and technology, the central control was so phenomenal that even in 20 to 21st century, that sense of control from the central authority still remains. There was a time when the king issued the calendar at the beginning of the year, and you were not even allowed to make a copy of that calendar. It was a punishable crime even to make a copy of the calendar. You had to buy a calendar from the king alone. To that extent, the knowledge and information was centralized, and that remained today. So that opens up some questions about relation of science and society and all that, but it's not topic that I'm going to talk about. The other great contributors to science were Arabs. Now, unfortunately, Arabs themselves have been very not very forthcoming in studying Arab scholarship of science. So a lot of lacuna remains in our understanding of evolution of science because the contribution of Arab scholarship is only vague. We do not have good solid pieces of translated text or even historicity and all that. But from 9th to 16th century, they were the central holders of all great knowledge. They were very pragmatic, very rich, and they sent out students all over the world to get their knowledge, documented it properly, preserved it properly, and worked on it. Okay, so that was their unique traditions. Unlike Indians who were very poor at documentation, the Arabs were very good at documentation. They carefully appreciated the importance of what they were doing. So, for example, 1, 2, 3, 4, as we write today, are called Arab numerals, but Arabs themselves are very clear that we have learned it from Indians. It is just that Europe learned it from Arabs, so they called it Arabic numerals. But rightfully, it should be called Indic Arabian numerals. They maintained records of everything, the best of ideas that they got from Assyria, Egypt, Greece, India, and even China. The full extent of their contributions yet to be appreciated because of the various biases that happen in the country of origin. They helped laying foundation of experimental sciences. They were the first ones to claim that the only way of validating any knowledge is through experimentation. It's an idea that Europe would accept, not create. And they contributed significantly to scientific methods. They laid foundation for empirical, experimental, and qualitative approach to working of nature. And they, of course, used Indian algebra number system as a very effective number system. They were not biased saying that we will only do what we had developed. If they had learned something from another culture, they happily adopted it. And one of the most delightful books to read, of course, is Al-Biruni's India, where he came to India to learn the workings of Indian civilization and its disintegration. And he documents it very beautifully in very great detail and in very honest way. And he also mentions at the end that Indians have great amount of knowledge, but eventually their pompousness, their xenophobia, and their arrogance is going to destroy them. And sure enough, in a few centuries, India ceased to be a major force in science because we became pompous, we became xenophobic, we became arrogant, and we became close to ideas from outside. So our interaction and the richness of culture that comes from interaction with the world ceased, and therefore we became isolated and eventually led to our downfall. Then comes the axiomatic approach. I still have 10 minutes. Assumes that nature is strictly logical in its way. The laws can be defined in the language of mathematics, and all laws called axioms are about working of nature. And if you wrote if from experiments, so Greeks had this idea that there are mythological ideas and there are axiomatic ideas. If you write down a bunch of equations that nature obeys, then nature must obey that equation all the time, everywhere. But the Greeks themselves did not realize the importance of what they were doing. So, for example, when Alexander comes to India in 326 BC, he brings a lot of Western knowledge to India, including astrology and so on. But he does not bring this extra axiomatic approach to science because he doesn't think that is important enough. So, even Greeks did not know the importance of this idea until Arabs would point it out good 1,000 years later. It was only in 16th century that other cultures, that human civilization realized the importance of this approach and the amount of knowledge that it would generate. So this approach has, for last 500 years, of course, this has been the most successful way of doing science. Axiomatic approach led to meticulous observations and development, but it predates a lot of other knowledge. So Galilean astronomy, Newtonian mechanics, thermodynamics, a whole bunch of sciences come up. Scientific conclusions are then drawn from direct reference to physical reality, and it was responsible for phenomenal increase in technology. Even today, scientists are divided between axiomatic and perceptionists. So I will just take one example. Dirac was a very classical axiomatic. He says it is important to understand the beauty of one's equations than to have them agree with experiments. It doesn't matter if my equation doesn't exist, agree with experiments. If it is beautiful, nature will obey that equation. He says my equations are smarter than me. On the other hand, you have Feynman who says I worship phenomena and not the explanations. I don't tell nature what to do. Nature tells me what it is doing. The very deal of a very great deal of truth, more truth can be become known than can be proven. So Feynman is very clear in his approach that there is a limit to axiomatic approach. Then Europe, of course, quickly progressed on this knowledge that they build up. I do not have too much of time, so I won't go into the story about how they develop various sciences and technologies. But they continue to use nature as the final arbiter, experiments as the only arbiter, and that would give them a phenomenal power. And of course, a whole bunch of technologies come up from here. Everything from gunpowder, guns to telegraph to a whole bunch of technologies would arise as a result of this great development. But they are now reaching a limit in the sense that now we are initially when simpler systems were being built, axiomatic approach very well. But over a period of time, as we study more and more complicated systems, just by defining axioms and then working on the consequences of axioms is not enough. And because partly because you cannot define any measure any quantity to arbitrary precision, and because you cannot define to arbitrary precision, you can never make full precise prediction. So this famous claim of Newton that based on his equation he can tell the from everything from beginning to the end of the universe is not really true, because we have realized now that nature cannot be measured with any level of great precision. There are several major reasons why it can't be done. Quantum mechanics itself gives you an idea that things are undeterminate, and therefore beyond a certain limit you cannot have precision. The very nature of inherent observer observed effect means that any attempt to observe anything will spoil what is being observed, and therefore you cannot have arbitrary precision. Thermodynamics says that once anything is in thermodynamic equilibrium, all knowledge inside it about individual particles is lost, and therefore you cannot create new knowledge. And then there is information paradox and black holes and so on, about irretrievable information, etc. So information and knowledge is being lost in this nature in natural way, and therefore you cannot have a completely axiomatic approach to nature. Nature will never be, for example, if you are familiar, come under Gödel's limits, because there are so many uncertainties in physics which are themselves inbuilt and not easy to undo, and therefore science will always remain approximate. So random nature of physical phenomena, the large ensemble problems, the statistical problem, etc., will mean that you will never have a precise science, and science will always remain an approximation. To the best, the only thing that you can say is that to the best of my knowledge, this is what happens, and that is where the limit of axiomatic approach comes in. I'm going to skip this slide. Essentially, it emphasizes the same thing, but essentially, the first principle approach is also becoming limited. So, for example, even though astronomy is essentially a play between gravity, nuclear forces, and magnetohydrodynamics, you don't start a paper in astronomy with either of these topics. You have generalized rules for that chemistry. Chemistry, for example, is essentially the properties of electron as a fermion and electrostatic forces and van der Waals forces. But when you start a paper in chemistry, you don't mention any of these things. You generalize laws of chemistry, you have generalized laws of astronomy, which are used because first principle and complete precision is just not possible in science. So science is now reaching a logic-based approach. The working of nature is best described in the language of mathematics. Then nature continues to obey all laws of mathematics. But given the complexity of nature, what will be the most predominant feature that will show up in any interaction is not amenable to purely mathematical interaction analysis, because we do not know mathematics with that precision. So search for pure mathematical formulations is not going to get you very far. And the best we can do is to say something is true to the best of available experimental evidence, and that's about all you can say. To the best of my knowledge and belief, this is what seems to be happening. And we have seen that sentence prove wrong in physics so many times that we no longer venture to say that I know how the physical world works independent of my existence. And that is how bad situation has become. So we could build on axiomatic system in isolated systems, but once you mix the systems, the complexities are simply overwhelming. So the only arbiter of science today these days seem to be proofs through simulations and animations. That only seems to be the best way of work going forward in our understanding. So the idea is now not to go for axiomatic approach, but to logic based approach, saying things are true to the best of our knowledge and belief at this stage. Um, and that is where things stand, for example. And there is also a question that, and I will come to that in a little while, which is that human beings were designed to eat, not be eaten and reproduce. So the senses that we have, sight is the most powerful, ear, so sound is the second most powerful, and then touch, taste, and smell are progressively less powerful. Given that we were designed with these five senses, we can see the world only through these five senses and add some instruments to it. But maybe nature does not work like that, and I will come to that in a minute. But before I do that, I just want to quickly summarize what I've been saying so far, which is that nature original, if I take on the x-axis time since the development of human beings, and y-axis I take the knowledge that is developed, then I end up with an interesting graph. So the interesting graph says that in the beginning, the ad hoc knowledge of tools, etc., comes from all civilizations. Then comes the pragmatic approach, which brought significant increase in knowledge from about 3-4,000 BC all the way to 1600 AD. And that pragmatic approach worked very well because it gave you farming, it gave you early urbanization, it gave you metallurgy, it gives you sophisticated cities and long distance trade and travel, and it gave you sophisticated astronomy and mathematics. Then it reached a saturation, and it would not have gone very far because of the qualitative nature of that study. But then the Arab period took the knowledge a little further. But then the axiomatic approach started by Newton would really pile up the knowledge much more, as a result of which we have classical mechanics, electricity and thermodynamics, we have space travel, chemistry, quantum mechanics, etc. But now, in the Einstein period and the uncertainty period of times of complexities, we are now reaching a level of saturation in that knowledge, and the future knowledge development will be based on logic, simulation, animation, and the statement will always be that to the best of our knowledge, this is how the system works. Whether there are hidden principles, etc., or not is difficult to say. Just to emphasize the point, the first part of the ad hoc system was essentially something that all cultures developed. The middle part, the pragmatic approach, is largely an Asian contribution, and only the axiomatic part or more modern one is what has come from Europe to the rest of the world. Just to complete, we need to think about the reflection on limits of human brains. Human beings, like I said, were designed to eat, not be eaten, and reproduce. And we have, in order to survive in the wild, we have hierarchical knowledge system. So we have visual senses are the most powerful. Then we have sound, audio systems, and then we have smell, and then touch and taste are, of course, for immediate contact. So there's only so much the brain can visualize. And that is also mixed up with some amount of knowledge of anticipation, causality, and all that allows you to develop some knowledge. But you can argue that maybe we are completely biased by our visual, our senses, and we have only forwarded from our senses, and nature may not be like that. And therefore, nature is not required to be understood by human beings. Human beings were never designed to understand nature. So, for example, if you look at Wolfram's A New Kind of Science, he says everything is complexity theory, and you can take cellular automata and build up how the nature works, and that gives you a very satisfactory explanation that does not require your recourse to senses or experimentation. Godel Escher is another book which fundamentally says that look, nature is recursive in its structure, and resonances, etc., create the variety that they do. Again, it is beyond human experiments, but then nature was never required to be understood by humans. So maybe these explanations and other explanations suggest that maybe nature is not meant to be comprehended by us. We don't know. And therefore, we need to worry about what the universe looks like. At the end of it, the question that we can ask is that, look, axiomatic approach and all is fine, but we are now reaching a stage of logical approach where we'll only be able to make statements by that things appear to be like this to the best of our knowledge and belief. So what is reality? And the answer only simply is who knows. So essentially with that, I would like to end my lecture and open myself to questions.
Thank you, Mayank. Now we can handle 3 questions from the audience.
I can handle, yes. Bola sir. So essentially the idea is that look, science is something that is a common human endeavor, and when we study science, there is no need to feel for us to feel defensive that we are studying something that Europeans created. Europeans simply built on what we had created. Yes. And in fact, the current science approach seems to be more like what Aryabhat would have liked rather than what Newton would have liked,
Doc-
or
Doc-
Feynman liked than Dirac liked.
Dr. Jayaraman, you want to ask anything?
There are some 11 questions in the chat, the 11 points in the chat.
No, we can handle only 3.
Okay. Oh, I'm sorry, don't have time, is it?
Satish, what Satish Patankar wants to say? So can you see those questions, Mayank?
Yeah, I can see the questions, yes.
You answer any 3 of them.
Okay. We have to close, is it?
Yeah.
Because some of the questions are really nice.
So you take
Somebody, Shaurya, I'm sorry I spoke a little fast. Dr. Jayaraman says the magic. Thank you. He's appreciated the talk. Thank you very much, Jayaraman sir. Subhash says that will the presentation be available on mail? You can get it on mail, but all these points are listed in my 2 papers in Current Science, which are available free. So you can go and look at Current Science 2016. I published 2 papers highlighting these issues.
the entire lecture.
Since then, I have added.
YouTube.
Achha?
Entire lecture is available on YouTube.
Yes, and the lecture is available. Exactly. And then Saka calendar, etc. I made some mistakes, so Abhijit has pointed them out. Thank you very much. The recording of the program is available on YouTube. Mayank has to unmute, but I think I did. Subhash Lomte says we had to leave early. Okay, I'm grateful if you could take excellent presentation. Satish Rao, thank you very much for your kind words. Thank you very much, Jayaraman Sahab. I'm glad you liked my lecture. And what, in your opinion, developed the consciousness? Now, consciousness is a very complicated subject. Okay, and I would like to take that as my first question to answer. Consciousness, right from the first human being, the life started as a single cell organism. Then, because it faced a variety of environment, the cells seem to have divided them, either made partnership with other cells that were floating around, or more likely, they made copies of themselves which were a little weak. So they could not reproduce on themselves, but they could protect the central cell. And that is how we get this first idea of a multicellular organism, where you have a central cell which has full capabilities, but has produced clones which are of lower capabilities, which can protect the main cell. And that is how you get early multicellular organisms. Then these multicellular organisms, when they were reproducing, obviously the errors in multiplication start to multiply if you just do a cell division. So the sexual reproduction comes in, where you take part of the genes from one being and part from the other, compare which are good, which are bad, and use the best of them, which gives you inefficient reproduction, but which gives you a much more fitter being. So sexual reproduction comes into being. And then in the meantime, in order to control all the cells that are around you, you have to have a central control system, and that is how nervous system comes up. At what stage nervous and consciousness is simply graded. So for example, if you show a mirror to a sparrow, the sparrow will try to break the mirror thinking that's another bird competing with it. If you show a mirror to the cat will try and see if it has stand up or not. So the level of consciousness increases systematically with life form. It is not a step function where it suddenly comes. Consciousness is a realization from the increasingly complex nervous system, which at some stage starts recognizing its own existence. And that comes very late. So the sparrows, for example, are not self-aware, but a cat is, mammals are. So how to handle consciousness itself is a matter of argument. Okay, I think evolution theory says that simplicity piled up to become complexity. Does this give rise to consciousness? It does. I think I just answered that in a different manner. So that's what Satish says. Jayaraman Sahab, thank you very much. I think I have completed all the questions that were there in the chat. Now we can open to any questions that people may have.
Sharath Kai, would you like to ask something? काळे साहेब आहेत का?
नाही सर.
आहेत काळे सर आहेत.
काळे सर विचारायचं का काही तुम्हाला?
आमचे अगारकर साहेब पण आहे.
नाही, काही
काळे
काय
सर,
सर काय विचारायचं आहे का?
नाही नाही साहेब, फाईन फाईन.
अच्छा विवेक पाटकर.
पाटकर साहेब.
Just one question that
Yes, sir.
you have stopped at the logical and simulation part
Correct.
where the evolution, as you say, stands today.
Yes, sir.
But as we look at the artificial intelligence developing,
Yes.
so will it not take over and perhaps we may become the lost species and which
No.
about which we should not regret?
Yeah. So artificial intelligence will certainly be there's one advantage for artificial system, which is that its memory is not limited. Human memory is limited. So beyond a certain level, if you want to have knowledge, you have to give away some knowledge or forget some knowledge. The life expectancy of unused knowledge in a human brain is 3 years. A life expectancy of unused knowledge in an artificial intelligence is infinite. As long as your electricity is there, it will work. So artificial intelligence will certainly be able to see patterns, etc., that we are not able to fathom. And they may even create new tools, new technologies, which we are not capable of doing. In that sense, they'll certainly be more intelligent than us. The question is not that. The question is whether, like mathematics, there are a set of rules which are consistent, accurate, and precise, and universally valid. And you can write those basic equations. But even then, there's a very famous Gödel's incompleteness theorem is that even if you take an axiomatic system which is perfectly defined, there will still be things that you cannot completely prove within that system. In that sense, and physics is even worse. Why does electron have the charge does it have? What are chaotic systems? What are fractal systems? When knowledge is lost in thermodynamic equilibrium, that knowledge is lost. Given those limitations, you will never have a fully axiomatic perception of science. And therefore it will always be approximation. Even if it is artificial intelligence, even if it finds patterns that human brain cannot, it'll approach will have to remain experimental and simulation or so and so on, never be completely axiomatic. Axiomatic system is not coming back. That is my contention. My contention is not that there are no patterns. There are patterns, and artificial intelligence will look up patterns and find patterns which we are incapable of doing because our brain is limited in size and capability. After all, we have only 1300 cc's of computing power, which is not all that great.
Yeah, but we use only hardly 4 to 5% of our brain
Exactly.
power. If you
Yeah,
can
but-
even double it.
Yes, but remember one thing, that those numbers are also an approximate. There are also ideas that you can put a silicon chip with additional memory so that you can remember things and all that. Those things are there, but we will never compete with the computational power that a supercomputer can have. And yet there are things that supercomputers today cannot comprehend that we human beings can comprehend. The instinctive feelings that human beings have is a phenomenal thing. There are interesting stories that writers have written about two civilizations that were completely dependent on artificial intelligence, and they kept on going to war, but because both were given by artificial intelligence and therefore logical sequences, they could not beat each other until one of the artificial intelligence system realized that they had a living system among them that they had preserved but never used, and they were instructed that in case the war reaches a stalemate, you activate this living being, and that living being comes into being. It is some sense of a human-like brain, and it can be creative and imaginative beyond what artificial intelligence could be, and therefore that party wins. So when it comes to creativity and imaginativeness, searching for abstract patterns, as regard using of how much brain we use, it's a very difficult thing to estimate. So for example, we normally assume that the right part of the brain, because it does not do any linguistic computation, is not really useful. But in fact, it is crucial to life. All instinctive knowledge comes from right side of the brain. But even then, at the end of the day, it is a 1300 cc limited memory system. So AI will certainly have pattern searches which will be ahead of us, but it will never bring back the axiomatic system of understanding the working of nature. And whether it should be brought back itself is a question you can ask.
Thank you.
Agarkar, you want to ask anything?
I'm very happy with what went on.
Very good. Dr. Tekale? No. I think Ghanshyam wants to ask something. Ghanshyam Deshpande?
Who, sir?
I think it is in chat box.
Okay, Raj Bhushan has a question saying that since I put hominin back to 2 lakh years, did Ramo, for example, exist 30,000 40,000 years ago? No. the human beings as a civilization are only 3 or 5 or 6 or at the most 10,000 years old. So no human as we know today of the stories is more than 10,000 years old. No. And Mahabharata and Ramayana, there's a problem. Mahabharata has some indications which suggest 1300 BC. Ramayana has no astronomical trackers which we can track and date it. But it seems that when the Sanskrit speakers from the west, from the Hindu Kush region were traveled east, they found this beautiful mythological story of Rama in that culture and translated it into Sanskrit. But dating it is tricky. But given that it doesn't have a horse, given that it doesn't have chariots and stuff like that, when Ram goes to Vanvas, he actually walks. Given that technological description of Ramayana, etc., it is certainly older than Mahabharata, but we don't know how much older. But it could not run into lakhs of years, no.
Yeah,
In
just
fact,
one.
Yes,
Sorry, just one small question. In the graph that you showed,
yes,
it was shown that our age is reaching a maturity and the graph is flattening.
yes.
Can a next step of evolution start a next upswing? I mean, what do you think about evolution? Evolution is a process still on, still
Correct.
incomplete,
Okay.
or how it is?
So there are two things that I want to say. Human brain 20,000 years ago was 1500 cc. Today it is 1300 cc. So we are actually less intelligent than our ancestors. We have less computing power than our ancestors of earlier time. Part of that loss is simply because we do not need the survival instincts in wild environment that our ancestors needed. Now we live in highly protected cities where the kind of threats that those people faced in jungle are not there. So that is one reason why brain can lose some of its power. But more importantly, probably what has happened is that the wiring within the brain has become very fine. It was probably much more coarse at that time. Now all this is speculation. But it's quite likely that the brain that time was a little clumsier, a little slower, and over a period of time, the wiring has become fine. But it's easy to show that the wiring now is so fine that if you try to increase the brain power, either the signal travel time will become so long that will become slow and sluggish, or the brain circuits themselves will start short circuiting and everybody will become schizophrenic. So we have reached a limit of how much this kind of design of intelligence can work on. So, and silicon chips, I have no idea how they will work. But the brains itself has now been optimized to the extent possible. In that sense, evolution, we don't see how it can create a brain which will be more capable. If it tries to hold more information, it will become sluggish. If it tries to become faster and more comprehending, it will become short-circuited. So evolution seems to have peaked in that sense of the brain power. Physical power, of course, you can become, one of the things that brain does is to look after the body. So if you make the body smaller for the same brain, you can increase the power. Elephant brain is bigger than ours, but it is less capable because it has a huge body to look after. So you can play games like those, but we are not going very far. What will change is our approach to the understanding of nature and evolution. What industrial revolution was to give us lots of tools with which we could probe. So the development in software and intellect will probably be more important than increasing brain power.
Okay, right.
Okay, we stop here. Mayank, you have made us to travel throughout the world with all the cultures of the world.
Thank you, sir.
It was a fantastic journey. And in one sentence, what Dr. Jayaraman has said, the celebrated lecture of the decade. So I think this is
Very
the
kind of you, sir. Thank
appreciation
you very much, Jairam, sir.
that you have got from the audience. Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you,
you
sir.
very much.
Thank you very much.
Our next lecture will be in the month of May, third Friday, 21st of May, by Professor Abhijit Dandekar. That lecture will be in Marathi. It will be on the Lipichi Jadan. That means how the script is developed. So he will be speaking basically on the script, not a particular script, but in general about these different scripts. I request every one of you to join the lecture next month on 21st of May at 5 p.m. Again on Zoom app, Facebook, and YouTube. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir.